So I wanted to make a video going a little bit deeper on breaking down different types of removal, different types of combat tricks, and different type of just creatures in limited. Just the simple, the commons. Um, and I also wanted to touch on some critiques or some questions people had about the original video. So I guess just one thing I want to touch on, because I wasn't super clear about it in the last video, is I was talking about these kind of cards as cards that threaten to take over the game when they're untapped with. They can demand answers and they can dominate vanilla boards. And I said why I think some of these, I'll remove Squirrel Girl, she was here for another reason, uh, were overrated, was I think these cards don't threaten to win the game by themselves and they don't demand an immediate answer. But I realized to properly explain that I was going to need to go talk deeper about the way that creatures attacking and blocking works in limited. But just to go a bit deeper, because for example, I might say, oh, Doom Reign Supreme is a card that wins the game by itself, and then I'll say, oh, Shield Deployment Drone doesn't. So what I mean specifically is that Doom Reign Supreme is a card that's very powerful, and if you build around it, it says, hey, like, I'm very powerful, and I can win the game. And part of why people are lower on it is because it's not very flexible. You need to have a lot of villains in your deck. It's hard to do that. Some of these cards fit that criteria, like Loki. This card says, hey, if you have a lot of cards I can copy, I'll be powerful. It's not necessarily that easy to do that. Same ways, Hilderblade. A lot of these cards have variations. Like Mr. Hyde, you could play it in any deck. If you have counters, it'll be a bit better, or stuff like that. But basically, one thing I also want to talk about is like the demanding answers aspect. So one thing I was touching on in the other video was I was kind of saying that. Oh yeah, and also one thing I want to say is that this whole video is aimed more at high stakes drafting. So high stakes drafting means like Pro Tour drafts. If you're playing a limited championship qualifier, high stakes draft, and I'm not focusing on the ladder at all. I try and do well in the high stakes drafts, and the ladder, that's not my focus at all. But I do think that understanding this will make you better at playing the ladder. But anyway, so or I think this applies to ladder. It's just that ladder doesn't like test your muscle. It's kind of like, like, I don't know, if you're trying to lift weights or something, if you're playing on ladder, it's like you have a 20-pound weight, so anybody can lift it. And if you do a high stakes draft, the weight goes to 100 pounds or whatever. 150 pounds, you actually need to build more muscle along the way. But if you lift 150 pounds, you can go back to lifting 20 pounds. I mean, I'm not trying to start a flame war in the comments section. People talking about how arena ladder, it's better than the PT, whatever. But basically what I'm saying is when you're doing something... Anyway, so I kind of made my point. I'll move on to the next thing. So, how do we start this? So yeah, I want to talk about vanilla creatures, vanilla removal, vanilla blockers. So what I mean by this is I've noticed in some of the recent sets, they kind of have removal spells that are effective against what I would call vanilla creatures, but not as effective against creatures with abilities. So Helicarrier Strike, that's, deal damage to attacking or blocking creature, very efficient, but it will be good against cards like, Brave Baller, Pet Avengers, not as much Drone. This is just here for other reasons, but it can be, it's not a bad exchange to Helicarrier Strike a Drone for 1 mana. But that is different than... It won't be as effective against these kind of cards. Like, if you have a Doom Reign Supreme, a Bruntar, any of these cards won't work. And you can see some of them are like Stolen Tark deck. So this is sort of a combat trick, but it's more effective when the game is more about vanilla creatures. Because, for example, you can imagine if your opponent has one of these strong cards in play, having a combat trick like a Stolen Stark Tech or Depower. Like, these cards are better when there's less creatures with abilities in play. And I guess I'll kind of call them Dark Confidant as creatures, or creatures like Mr. Hyde. I mean, you can say they're effective in the sense that they enable you to attack, but what I mean is very early on in the game, if your opponent plays a card that's very threatening, or can be very threatening, like a Loki, a Mr. Hyde, an Echo, and I know some people will disagree with me, or they'll disagree that these cards are threatening, but these are all just variations of cards that say draw an extra card a turn. I picked these cards specifically because people think they're bad. There's obviously stronger versions of these cards, or versions of these cards that people think are good. Anyway, there's just kind of cards that can threaten to snowball, and like if your opponent's threatening to snowball, then when you're playing a card like one of these cards that's threatened to snowball, then they can create such an insurmountable advantage that these vanilla creatures won't matter as much. So then these kind of combat tricks, or these kind of removal spells that help your vanilla creatures attack, are not as effective when your opponent's threatening to just snowball the game completely. And then there's also what I would call vanilla blockers, which I'll talk about a bit more, which are kind of cards like Forecasting Fortune Teller, these Death Touch creatures. These creatures are not that effective when, again, if your opponent has one of these engine cards that threatens to do a lot when they untap, if you play any of these cards, they're not as effective. And I'll talk about Hero in Training a little bit more in a second, because I know it'll be a little bit more controversial. People will say, it's the best card, one of the best cards of all time. They might, want to Black Lotus it and play in Vintage Cube. But anyway, so what I'm trying to say is, like, you can imagine, and I'll make this simpler. So, like, you can imagine if your opponent plays a big land cycler, like a Stratosaur, it's a 5-mana 3/5. That card matters. It's big, and in those situations, it's going to be helpful to have a Blossom Bind or Helicarrier Strike, or if they threaten to block, having a card that lets you attack into it. And similarly with these blockers, if your opponent plays like a Pet Avengers and you play a Serpent Specialist, then that can pretty effectively stop it from attacking. Or you play a Fortune Teller and they play a Brave Brawler. Or for example, Hero in Training, what I'm trying to say is that it's a pretty good blocker, because if your opponent plays a Brave Brawler and you play Hero in Training, your Hero in Training is pretty good at blocking the Brave Brawler. Even if they power it up, maybe you play a second Hero in Training, and even if they play a combat trick like a Stark Tech or Depower, you still, drew your card. But basically what I'm trying to say is, like, these kind of blockers, they're more effective against these kind of creatures. And I'll break it down a little bit more here, where I'll say there's a lot of, like, layers of the ways combat tricks work. So I will say, like, generally, you tend to want combat tricks. One of the best things to combine combat tricks with is creatures that your opponents really want to block. So Moonglove Extractor is a really good example. That's it's a 3-mana 2/1. When it attacks, you draw a card and lose a life. If you attack with this, it's really hard for your opponent to not block it. If they don't block it, it's good for you. Atuma would be another example. It's a 4-mana 3/4, so it's kind of understated, but when it attacks, it draws a card. So basically, if you are able to attack with this, your opponents really want to block. And in that situation, having a combat trick is gonna go a very far way. Whereas if you have so basically I'm saying that, like, to make combat tricks better, it's good to play creatures that your opponents are really forced to block. Obviously, it's not as effective if you play other stuff. And there's a bunch of different nuances. So for example, there are cards that just have keywords, like Lifelink, like the Night Nurse. She's just a lifelink creature, so automatically, like, with some kinds of combat tricks like Equipment, then you can get a bit of extra value with that. There's cards like Kree Commando. That card has Vigilance, so for example, it can be easier to use combat tricks because you get attack and block. So you can really dominate the board with a Vigilance creature in a way with combat tricks in some ways, especially with Depower where they need a block. And then Widow's Bite kind of plays into what I was talking about, where it's a pretty good kind of vanilla-y spell, in the sense that, like, it's really good at pushing through any creature, because in the late game you can give any creature Death Touch, so whatever they block, you can give Death Touch, but if one element of it is pushing through creatures. And I was also going to say, like, different kinds of creatures want different types of combat tricks. So for example, if you have a creature that cares about heroic, like targeting, like Colleen Wing, then, Blazing Crescendo can be good because you just want to target it. But meanwhile, you might have a creature like Ronin that just cares about equipment, so then you want equipment. And then you might have just random cards like Captain America that get better when you have ways to pump their power. And I'll talk about one thing very quickly. Sometimes people will look at a rare like Captain America and they'll be like, oh, it's just one of the best rares. You don't need to put any effort to build around it. But I think a lot of understanding Magic is you're just trying to make powerful, like, you're trying to enable your cards, make your cards powerful. Or it's just an obvious statement that, like, increasing the power, like, Captain America is a good card, but it goes crazy when you increase its power. It goes from, like, a solid card to, like, it's just insane, wins the game. Like, what does it do? It pumps your whole board equal to its power. So, like, for example, Blazing Crescendo is a card that people don't consider very good, but if I have, like, 2 Colleen Wings and, like, a Captain America and something else, obviously White-Red's supposed to be a heroic theme, but you can kind of get the idea of what I'm getting at. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that, like, combat tricks, obviously they're better when you try and make your opponent block. Because if you just play random vanilla creatures, like, I'll break down, I'll give some examples here. And I'll get into the vanilla blockers. Like, for example, Galactic Wayfinder. This card's very good. Or Hero in Training is a good example. People love that card. Hero in Training, like, obviously if you attack with this, your opponent kind of wants to block, but they're not as forced. I'll just go with Galactic Wayfinder. It's like the 3-mana 3/3, and it basically can ramp you when it comes into play. It was one of the best common steads of Eternities. It's powerful, but it's not as powerful with combat tricks because your opponent can just shrug it off more easily, or you might be more defensive. And I'll talk about the other thing. So here I'm kind of talking about when combat tricks are good, when you're attacking, when you're trying to make your opponent block, when you have synergies with combat tricks in various ways. Like Moon Glove and Guilt Leaf's Embrace is a pretty good combination. Or sometimes if you have lifelink, your opponent might feel coerced into into blocking. Like if you have a 2-1 lifelinker, then they might feel like, okay, well, maybe I should block this because otherwise it's just going to gain the life, whatever. So then like combat tricks can be good with that. And also, yeah, I wanted to distinguish on tricks that generate a lasting advantage versus not. I'm not saying they're better or worse, but a card like Giant Growth, it doesn't generate a lasting advantage. So like a card like Depower is like if you get them to block and then you cast it and you draw a card, you get your payoff right there. Same with Crescendo, same with Guilt Leaf. Like these cards, if you cast them, you just get the payoff. Whereas Giant Growth, the payoff's a little bit more narrow. It's more just in the fact that it's offering tempo. Like it's easier. It's a more simple combo to be like, I'm gonna force my opponent to block and then I'm gonna 2-for-1 them. That's more exciting than I'm gonna force my opponent to block and then I'm gonna 1-for-1 them, right? Like that's obvious. Then I'm also going to talk about vanilla blockers. These are creatures that can be powerful in the context of your blocking. So it's like, okay, like why do you care about blocking? Usually you care about blocking if you're a more controlling deck or you have board stall. So for example, none of like all these cards are not as strong with these removal. But what are they good with? If you have cards like a lot of inevitability in the late game, like a lot of card draw, maybe mana sinks like Avenger's Tower, you know, if you're trying to get to the late game, then just blocking your opponent's, you know, creatures is obviously something worthwhile to do. And I kind of put some in the middle, cards that are like Wayfinder or Hydraulic Helper or Loan Shark, like cards that draw a card when they enter the battlefield, or cards that maybe just help you ramp to your mana sinks. Like the context in which you might want these cards are, again, when you're kind of trying to block and get to these, when your game plan is centered around cards like this, Forge, Avengers Tower, whatever. Also, one thing I've noticed that I think is underrated is that these blockers help you conserve your removal. So, like, usually if you're playing a control deck, you want some removal for your problematic tournaments. But the problem is, if it's like, if your opponent just plays a vanilla, you know, a creature, like, I don't know, like just a random 3/3, like a vanilla, like a 2-mana Watch Wolf, a 2-mana 3/3, like, if you, like, playing these vanilla blockers, if you don't have a play to make, like, if you can't remove it, you might feel pressure to use your removal spell. Like, I guess what I'm trying to say is, like, if you can't block your opponent's creatures, you might feel pressure to use removal because otherwise you take too much damage and that will be bad for you. So these cards actually are almost like extra removal in a way, because Forecasting Fortune Teller says, oh, if my opponent plays a 2-mana 3/1, I don't have to worry about shocking it or Widow's Biting it because I can just play this, deal with that, have my Widow's Bite for later. So, like, these can actually be good in control decks in the sense that they're like, now I can really just focus my removal on their creatures with abilities. And yeah, we can notice different kinds of weaknesses. Like these slower engine cards, like these attacking creatures are better against them, whereas these kind of like let me almost pull up a whole symmetry or pyramid. Like, so like if we look at these vanilla creatures or whatever, so like Brave Brawler can be good against, you know, something kind of aggressive, like not as good but like a card like Kree Commando or some of these vanilla creatures, but a card like Brave Brawler could be really bad against some of these vanilla blockers, like a Serpent Specialist because it costs 1 mana, a Forecasting Fortune Teller, like a Hero in Training because it draws a card, any of these cards that draw a card, whatever. But these cards can be weak against these engine cards, because if you play a Forecasting Fortune Teller and they play Mr. Hyde, you're not pressuring them at all and they're going to draw extra cards. So it's kind of like understanding that there's going to be different situations where these cards are good. Like, basically I'm saying your Serpent Specialist will be good when it's blocking one of those creatures, but it'll be bad against the engine card. I'm saying like some of these cards can get punished by these blockers, but they'll be good against the other stuff. Then I wanted to talk about other things. Another problem I have with commons, and a few things. So one thing I'll say is that flexibility is like a form. I think flexibility gets like really underrated in Magic, and I think it's because people think to win in Magic, you need to win so much, right? Like, let's say you go to a Grand Prix, it's 1,500 people, only 8 people top 8. So a lot of people put a lot of power or put a lot of emphasis on like trying to create, trying to spike the lottery, trying to put like really high variance strategies, or they'll think you need a very high variance strategy to win. And they'll underrate a little bit of just like, I'm going to consistently try and get a 60% win rate, consistently have a good win rate. So I think like sometimes people will be like, why would I care about, you know, flexibility? I just want to do the most powerful thing because I need to top 8 this tournament, rather than I'm going to play 10 tournaments and I want to go like 70% win rate on average across them all. I don't know if that was explained well, but basically I think there's a reason why people underrate flexibility, and it's going to be obvious when I explain it. And yeah, there's a few cards. Like I give like a Joker card explains why. So let me explain what I mean by this. what I mean by this is a lot of these commons are not as flexible as people think. Because when I break down what different decks want, I'm saying that there's a decks that want to attack, and then they might want to play cards that make it hard for the opponent to block. And then I'm saying there's decks that might want to block and then win with inevitability and card advantage. So, for example, Forecasting Fortune Teller is an extremely good blue card, but if you end up in an aggressive deck trying to attack, it's not going to be that desirable, even though it's one of the best commons, and people might think, oh, yeah, it's just good in any deck. Like I'm saying with so what I'm trying to say with some of these cards is a lot of them, if you see the kind of pyramid I'm setting up of different types of games, like Virus Beetle's a pretty good blocker, Grave Pack's an okay attacker. What I'm saying is, if you ask what your deck strategy is trying to do, a lot of decks should say, I'm trying to be an aggressive deck attacking and four things for my blockers, or I'm trying to be a deck with inevitability and winning with card advantage. Or maybe you're a mid-range deck, but it's kind of hard to be in the middle. Like, you don't really want to necessarily be a deck that has a ton of, like, Galactic Wayfinders and then playing a bunch of, like, weird combat tricks, because it's almost too different. Like, I don't know, I don't want to get, sidetracked into stuff. But what I'm trying to say is that, like, when you're trying to make a versatile deck work, you can kind of see how these commons, they don't fit actually in as many decks. Also, like, what I'm trying to say is about doing something powerful is, even though a card like Doom Reign Supreme is narrow, and I'm not saying pack one, pick one it, but it... Let me think, because it's obviously not a flexible card. Let me think. I guess what I'm trying to say is these cards, people think, oh, I'll take Shield Deployment Drone, and I'll play it in any deck, and it'll be great. And I'm kind of saying, I don't think it's that simple. I don't think that if you really try and maximize what the efficiency of the deck, the power of your deck, you just want to play in any deck. You really kind of want to think, am I an attacking deck? Am I blocking? You want to think of the whole spectrum of using vanilla tricks and removal, the cohesion of your whole deck, and that when you really think about all this, you'll realize that, where is this desirable? You'll realize some things that you thought might be always desirable are actually not if you break it down. I think a good example Sam Black gave with Shock was, this was many years ago, and there was a format where Boros aggro was a deck, and Sam said you shouldn't play Shock in the Boros decks, because the reason why, like, people think Shock's a great card. It sees constructed play. That's usually something in limited. Like, when a limited card sees constructed play, people just think, oh yeah, it's good, I'll take it. But Sam kind of said, in that format, the Boros creatures were all very small. So they didn't have problem attacking into small creatures. They had problems attacking into big creatures. And though the Boros aggro deck in that format wanted to play a lot of creatures. It had a lot of go wide playoffs. Like, it didn't want, like, it's, most aggro decks, you don't want to play a lot of non-creature spells, potentially. So he was saying, because you don't want to play a lot of non-creature spells, you really want your non-creature spells to help it so that your small creatures can attack through big creatures. And if they play a small creature, you can just attack and they trade. And that's kind of a sense of, like, when you really think about what your archetype's trying to do. And obviously it depends on the format. Like, if there's a bomb like Captain Coulson, you'll want to shock it. This was a more boomer, older format where there's less bombs like that. Then there's also, it's a question of, like, what makes a card good. This is kind of a whole other tangent, but if you really think about it, it's, like, because it's efficient. If you ask, what does efficiency mean? It exists within an ecosystem of, like, curve and cohesion. So cohesion means what's your overall strategy of your plan. Like, for example, I was saying Crescendo, if you're playing a bunch of, like, Colleen Wings and Captain Americas, then it's actually desirable. It's actually, might be a good card in your deck, because it's cohesive with your game plan. Like, if you're playing, I guess, creatures like Moonglove Extractor that force your opponent to block, playing combat tricks, then that's desirable. It's good with your game plan. Whereas, like, let's say you play a lot of cards like Avengers Towers and Futurist Forge, then these cards become desirable because they're cohesive with your game plan. That's what I mean by you can get efficiency, you can get power out of cohesion. And also curve is a whole other can of worms, but it's basically just talking about, like, trying to be mana curve, trying to be mana efficient. It's kind of saying that, like, I've talked about this before, but it's like sometimes people will think about cards as good cards and bad cards, right? And the most simple example I will give is, like, let's say somebody goes, they play they're going to play only really good uncommons. They go really good 2-drop uncommon on turn 2. Turn 3, 2-drop. And then turn 4 they go 4-drop. Turn 5 they go 4-drop. Every card they play really good uncommons. Then the opponent goes 2, 3, 4, 5, and the opponent's just playing commons. Now the reason why the player went 2, 3, 4, 5 is actually probably in a relatively similar position to the one who went 2, 2, 4, 4 is because what makes the uncommon so good? The reason that 2 mana uncommon is so good is because it's 2 mana. But if you're playing it on turn 3, you're not getting the power of its efficiency. You're wasting a mana. So even though they play a mediocre 3-drop, like, what I'm saying is, if they play a mediocre 3-drop and you play a good 2-drop, well, joke's on you, it's pretty similar. If they play a mediocre 5-drop and you play a good 4-drop, joke's on you, it's pretty similar. A lot of I don't know where all these typos are coming from. A lot of these unlocking power. That's why curve is so important for power, because it's not like you just play really good cards. You also have to spend all your mana, otherwise you're not getting what makes the card good, the fact it's efficient. If you play a really good 2-drop on turn 5, that's not what makes it good. You're not getting its power. Then there's another question I put here, which what makes removal good. That's like a really deep can of worms, but the most simple answer is it deals with cards that can't be beaten otherwise. But yeah, anyway, that's a whole other thing. Then another thing I wanted to talk about is just keeping it simple and this. So this relates to the difference between the commons and these rares. So like, people will say, like, for example, I'll say shield deployment drone's not that powerful because it doesn't threaten to take over the game. And then people, they'll make it complicated. They'll try and create these situations where they'll say, well, if you have political triumph, shield deployment drones are really good, right? But it's like, wait a second. Political triumph is an extremely powerful uncommon, so I don't know which one's doing the heavy lifting there. Or what I'm trying to say is people will be like, they'll be like, you kind of have to create a situation. It's what I was talking about support versus engine earlier. Like, obviously, it's not that bad. That's part of why the drone's a good card, because you play it and it can't be that bad. But to really make it powerful, you want to do these extra things. Again, forecasting Fortune Teller can never really be that bad. But to really crank up the power is you play it in a Convoke Waterbending type of deck, or you play it in the kind of, again, what I'm talking about, in a blocking inevitability deck where you're like, yeah, I really want to block their vanilla creatures. Where was I going? Just keeping it simple. So again, it's like, now what I'm saying is you can't just put this in a card and it's like, oh yeah, build your deck around me and I'm going to win the game. Whereas what I'm saying is Doomreign Supreme, like some of these cards, they're like, yeah, if you build your deck around me, I will win the game. I will be very powerful. I will be like plus 10% to win the game for you. Whereas these cards are like, yeah, I'm not going to be plus 10% to win the game for you, but, you know, I might have good synergy with other good cards, and I'm not going to be that bad. You know, you can always rely on me. That's what I'm talking about by keeping it simple. Yeah. So, in a way, I know Doomreign Supreme, it's a narrow card or whatever, or all these things, but again, that's what I'm talking about. That I'm saying that these cards, that they're not just to unlock the power, to make them really threaten the game, you kind of have to make, I think, like a more convoluted shield. Like, for example, Loki. People will say, oh, it's or Echo and Loki. People will be like, oh, Loki, but you need a 2-drop. I don't think, like, casting a 2-mana spell and then using Loki to copy it, and then, like, if you do that a couple times, it's very hard for your opponent to get back in the game. Or Loki, like, if you play a Herbie and then pay 1 mana, draw an extra card, do these kind of things, or, God forbid, sacrifice a Doomreign. Oh, it has to be creature source. Okay. But what I'm trying to say is, like, it's not that complicated. Like, they kind of tell you, just do this, and then I'll be good. Whereas these cards, they don't really tell you, just do this, and then I'm going to do something crazy. That's kind of what I'm saying. I'm saying these cards say, do this, and then I'm going to do something crazy. These cards don't say, do this and do something crazy. That's what I'm saying by keeping it simple, blah, blah, blah. Whatever. I covered a lot of this. Yeah, then I covered a lot of this. Yeah, different types of tricks. Because, yeah, it's interesting, because it's a very small thing to minor, and it goes from set to set. But for example, like, Colleen Wing very specifically wants heroic things. So if you're in a Colleen Wing deck, you don't really want a supersuit as much because she doesn't get value from the supersuit, I'm pretty sure. And then, like, same with Ronin. Like, if you have Ronin, you don't care about Blazing Crescendo as much because it wants equipment. And obviously there's, you know, stuff in the all kinds of things you could say about that. Or, like, for example, with Kree Commandos, since it has low toughness, it almost rather has a trick like Depower, whereas Blazing Crescendo is better with, like, higher, like, with a card like Atuma. So what I'm trying to say, it's not like you can just be like, this is the kind of trick. It actually very much depends on the overall kind of ecosystem of cards you're working with. Like, cards like that give Death Touch or give low toughness are better with higher toughness creatures, and then cards that give a lot of toughness, like Supersuit or Depower, are better with Night Nurse or whatever. Yeah, then I talk about where this can be desirable. This was just like run other things. I mean, I think one of the big problems people can have in Limited is they focus too much on good card versus bad card instead of thinking, where can this card be good? Why is it good? The overall, you know, bigger picture. Yeah, I'm also saying that, like, this is a big thing for high stakes versus lower stakes, or high stakes versus arena, in my opinion, is that in a high stakes draft, like let's say you're playing the World Championship top 8 draft, you need to be very flexible, very good at understanding these very subtle things. But if you play on arena and you're just going to get so many good cards, you don't need to understand these things. Sure, it won't come up. But I'm saying if you're trying to do, like, really push the limit, win at pods with very tough opponents, you have to be very much into understanding these small things. Why did I have these pictures of these cards? I wanted to bring up some other things, some other sort of form of counterplay to creatures that attack. So I brought up, like, Moonglaive Extractor, and I was going to say that, like, one of the cards that can be good against Moonglaive, like I already said, creatures that can block. I just brought up Fanatic of Harrowing as another example. That's just a 4-mana creature that basically draws a card when it enters. sometimes I also notice that sometimes they put a lot of life gain in a set, and that can kind of punish just dealing chip damage. Like I felt that in Strixhaven. Some of the sometimes I play an aggressive deck, and if I got paired against Golgari deck, which is a bunch of Soul Sister, Bogwater, Lumerance, it just gained so much life. It felt silly. Pursue the Past just gained a lot of life. That can make cards like Perforating Artist that mostly gets value by dealing damage worse. And yeah, just wanted to put Thrag Test kind of gains life, and again, these kind of creatures that draw a card when they enter, they can be good against creatures that attack. Because again, like if your opponent plays a Moonglove Extractor, I mean, I guess if you play like a 2-for-1 creature, they can kind of get the value back in some ways. But yeah, I'm trying to say versus creatures that mostly get their value from attacking, you can try and block them, and versus certain kinds of cards, you need to be proactive. Like to beat Doom Reign Supreme, you need to be proactive or have exactly web up, or maybe your opponent doesn't have villains because in the comments you think this card's unplayable. Whatever. That's kind of the point that I was making here. So yeah, wrapping it up quickly, it's just talking about there's a lot of cards I guess that were very situational. Like I realized Blossom Bind's really bad if my opponent has a card with abilities but if my opponent plays a really big Stratosaur, I'm really going to want it. And it's what's Stratosaur good against? Well, Stratosaur could be good against cards like Shield Deployment Drone. And then it's kind of realizing this whole ecosystem of what different cards that line up have different bad or good matchups. People love to talk about bad or good matchups. Vanilla Removal has a good matchup against vanilla creatures. And then you can say Vanilla Blockers have a good matchup against vanilla creatures. They have a bad matchup against engine cards. And then this kind of whole ecosystem I'm talking about and understanding the way it all fits in. Yeah, and I guess that's I think that's most of what I wanted to cover on the other video. And again, that's why I think these comments are overrated, because I think when you understand all these things, for me, I just don't value them as highly. And yeah, I think I kind of gave a lot of reasoning why. And again, one thing I want to clarify on is none of this is saying a card's good or bad. It's always contextual based on expectations. It's not saying a card is good or bad. I'm saying I think a card is worse than people think it is, or I think a card is better than people think it is. It's relative to expectations. I'm saying I think these cards are worse than people think. I'm not saying they're bad. I don't think there's anything wrong with some of these cards. But I think if people see Shield Deployment Drone or Gravepack Monoist and they freak out and they're yeah, this is such an awesome card, then I'm saying I'm lower on that. Or I'm not saying Doom Reign Supreme's amazing, but I'm saying it's definitely a card that you can be very powerful, and if you end up in the deck, it can be very powerful. So again, it's not saying these cards are good or bad, it's just saying relative to expectations, because that's what draft is. It's not just pack one, pick one, it's pick 8. You have 5 bad, there's 5 cards left in the pack, you have 5 different bad cards, and you have to decide out of these bad cards, which one should I take and why. And then, yeah. So anyway, that's most of it, yeah.